Everyone, thanks for gathering here in the room and at home, wherever you may be. With us on the Zoom, direct from a nondescript, undisclosed location within the Haaretz building, I'm told, is Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, a good friend and an oft-quoted and authoritative expert on Israeli public opinion and a strategic consultant with decades of experience. Dahlia specializes in liberal and progressive social causes. That's a nice way of saying she's a bit of a Smolenit. She has advised 9 national campaigns in Israel and has worked in 15 other countries at last count. Is that right? Is it 9 or is it 10 now?
No, it's still 9, but it's changing daily.
Give it a minute.
Yeah.
Dahlia is perhaps uniquely well pedigreed to talk to us. I didn't check this with you. I hope it's okay. To talk with us about this moment in Israeli history and political foment. She is the daughter of Judge Shomrei Scheindlin, or I believe retired judge on the Southern
Retired
District.
from the court, not from work.
Exactly. Who may be best known for overturning New York City's stop and frisk policing policy, and of Raymond Scheindlin, an emeritus professor at JTS. Dahlia has been an Israeli citizen, I believe, since 1997.
Yeah, God,
which was
you're
also
good on the
year-
details. Are you a journalist?
That was also the year that I made Aliyah to the New York Times. Dahlia's research and analytical expertise extend to pretty much everything I would ever need to write about were I still in Jerusalem: the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, regional foreign policy, democracy, human rights, civil rights, minority issues, issues of religion and the state, which is kind of the Israeli answer to our separation of church and state. There's no real separation there. And of course, the gift that keeps on giving, Israeli politics. She holds a Ph.D. in political science from Tel Aviv University and has taught there and at other esteemed universities. She's a co-founder of Plus 972 magazine, a member of the advisory board of Jewish Currents, a fellow at the Century Foundation, and a co-host of the Tel Aviv Review podcast. Welcome, Dahlia.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you also for the nice yichus for my parents.
Yes. Dahlia, a word about our shul. You could say that Congregation Shomrei Emunah is getting back into the Israel game after a long layoff. We're a little rusty, you might say. We kind of avoided the subject for a while. I don't think we are alone in that. You may have heard it's a bit of a third rail for many American synagogues and particularly for their rabbis. But I don't know if she's here yet, but we have a new spiritual leader here, Rabbi Julie Roth, and she has boldly ventured out into that arena, calling our attention to the situation and to its importance, not just to Israel, but to us in America and to the Jewish people as a whole. So here we go. Dahlia, can you just start by updating us on the latest? I know that you've been out in the protests. What's going on?
Well, let me give a little bit of background. The government that was formed by Netanyahu, it's his 6th government. It was formed in the final days of 2022. And within 1 week, within practically, I think it was even less than a week, the justice minister, who is a member of Netanyahu's party, a Likud figure, unveiled a plan for judicial reforms to reform the judiciary and particularly the Supreme Court that were so sweeping that a great number of Israelis felt like it would essentially end the independence of the Israeli judiciary and became very panicked about it. And right away, there were large-scale protests, although nowadays they've been dwarfed, but within the first 2 weeks, there were protests that were 20,000, more than 20,000. But for the last 11 weeks, there have been mass protests. So we're coming up on several months now of protests that have topped 100,000, topped 200,000, and have reached over 200,000 people every week on Saturday nights, which is the end of our weekend, but also during the week. And the difference is that I would call it that the protests, the big demonstrations on the weekends are a display of opposition, but the protests during the week are efforts to actually disrupt the normal functioning of society. It's a serious distinction because those protesters during the week are trying to tell the Israeli government, we will not be able to function. We are worried that our state won't protect us. We are worried that this is going to be a fundamentally different kind of state and we don't accept it. And that you may be a legitimately elected government, but you're doing things that are crossing a line into changing the regime of Israel to begin with. And we won't let the state function under those circumstances. And I think that I think all of us have been surprised at the extent to which many members of the public and specific professional communities and social communities in the name of their communities, whether it's the medical community, including mental health workers, right through to Army reservists and pilots, are saying, we can't accept this because it will affect us, it will affect our professions, it will affect our ability to do their job. And this is so extreme that we have to actually take action that will disrupt normal life. Nevertheless, from the government's perspective.
Hang on a second, Dahlia. We have a sound problem.
Oh,
Jeff, can you get in there?
Somebody.
Sorry, we have a technical issue.
no worries.
Dahlia, say something?
Hello, can you hear me?
We don't have her.
I'm gonna, we're back now, but I'm gonna ask.
Let's make sure that we have sound.
Everybody can scoot down one chair. I'm gonna move that chair down. Okay, you're back.
Okay, but I want to make sure that we have sound in the room and on the Zoom.
It's a coffee,
We have like a hair trigger kind of set up here. Okay, yes, no shifting in your seats, people. Dahlia, say something.
1, 2, 3.
Oh,
4,
there we
5.
go. There we go. We
Okay.
got you back. Okay, great.
Okay, I'm worried about that hair trigger because a lot of what's going on here is very triggering for many people. Yeah. So if I tell you what the government's been doing, it might trigger the sound. Anyway, the government's perspective is that the different parties in the coalition, there are 4 parties in the coalition. One of them has broken up into other factions, so there's actually more than 4 parties, but they are all committed to this. It's not that one party wants this reforms and the others don't. All of the 4 parties are so committed to these reforms that they made the judicial reform a very signature part of the actual guidelines for the government that they commit to in writing, and that they are required by law to publish before the government is sworn in. So in that document.
Can I just interrupt? How much did they actually campaign on that?
Well, that is a very good question. So the different parties did different things. The Likud, let me just start with the biggest party, which is Likud. That's Netanyahu's party, 32 seats, the biggest party in the Knesset and parliament, and of course, the biggest party in the coalition. His party did everything they possibly could not to talk about what reforms they would make. And I know this because I have been researching and tracking and writing about the issue of the tension around the judiciary in Israeli society, specifically over the last roughly 2 years. But actually, I've been writing about it throughout the course of the last 10 years. And in fact, I think the first op-ed I ever wrote about what I saw as an emerging criticism slash, almost like an attack on the court was back in 2007, because there have been tensions around the court for a long time, but it has spread into a broader critique of the entire judiciary, and it had become much more heated over the last few years. So I was listening very closely on this campaign. It was clear to me that this was already a central issue, and Likud figures, every time they gave interviews, journalists would ask them as well, because everybody wanted to know, what are your positions on the judicial reform? And every single person who was interviewed would say, well, we think it needs reform. We don't want to destroy. We want to constructively reform, and we won't get into the matter. That was the stock answer on the political campaign for Likud. Now, by total contrast, the second largest party in the electoral results, which has since broken up, that's the party called Religious Zionism, and it includes the very nationalist religious communities. Some of them are neo-Kahanis, followers of Meir Kahane. That party did the exact opposite. They published a very detailed plan for judicial reform, and the terms are disputed. I mean, I still call it judicial reform only because it's a very easy way to convey what we're talking about. But many people here call it the attempted judicial coup or takeover. But I still think it's just easier to talk about reform so we know what we're talking about. That party published a very detailed plan. It was actually a booklet. They held a press conference. They wanted everybody to know what was in it, and they generated debate, and they timed it for a moment when everybody would be paying attention, which was just about 2 weeks before the election. And that program was considered, I mean, I read it and I thought, this is built on the same principles that other people have advocated reforming the judiciary who are critical of the judiciary. But it was so extreme that it looked a little bit like a publicity stunt. Nevertheless, one of the leading members of that party, who is one of the two people who really authored that document, is currently the chair of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. Okay, so if we didn't, nobody knew how seriously to take that plan. Well, that party did very well. It came in third place in the elections. It got 14 seats. It's the second biggest party in Netanyahu's government, although again, it broke up into factions. And that senior figure, his name is Simcha Rothman. He is the head of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee. This has been his life's project for the last number of years, critiquing the judiciary. He has written a book about why the Supreme Court behaves like a political party. He established, sort of think tanks and small NGOs to basically drive the point home that the judiciary has behaved badly, and particularly the Supreme Court, taken too much power in Israeli society and needs to be, reined in. And so as head of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, actually, he has stepped in to develop the legislation that was proposed by the justice minister. But it's really this person, Simcha Rothman's plans now that are being established as the basis for the legislation that is currently being debated. And some of those pieces of legislation have already reached the first vote. We need to have 3 votes for them to pass into law. And just let me know when you're ready for me to discuss what those are. But let me just, to finish answering your question, there are 2 other parties in the government. They are 2 ultra-Orthodox parties. Okay, now those parties don't have to campaign, really. They do have campaigns, but they don't really have to, because they pretty much have, especially the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, they have a built-in constituency who, the vast majority of them vote for them. And Shas does have to compete. Shas is the party it's the ultra-Orthodox party. Not all of its voters are ultra-Orthodox, but Shas competes with Likud somewhat. And it's very close with Likud. Its leader, Aryeh Deri, is one of the closest allies to Netanyahu. And they didn't have to talk much about this, because over the years, they've been generally on the side of the growing number of voices in Israeli society who view the Supreme Court and, in general, the judiciary and the figures of judicial authority as an enemy. And I use that word advisedly.
Yeah, let's just back up for a second. What is it that the right, generally the religious right we're talking about primarily, what is it that they have such a problem with about the Supreme Court? I mean, do the supporters of this overhaul in any way have a point? I mean, they are collectively, this government is the majority. Shouldn't the majority rule?
Yeah, well, there are so many layers to that question. They do have a parliamentary majority. They have won 64 out of 120 seats. The way things are going in Israel, that is a firm majority. But remember that they only actually got 48.3% of the votes, and that most people who voted for the coalition were not really voting on this issue. Okay, we know that from survey research. Although the issue of the judiciary and the role that it has been playing has become increasingly divisive, as you pointed out, it's largely among the religious right, but not only. Remember, Likud right now is taking a leading role, even though it was quiet before the elections, and Likud is not a religious party.
Right.
But the argument, you want me to explain the argument?
I guess I just want to know, what is it that the Supreme Court has been doing or blocking that is so important to the right wing, that they're so exercised that they want to take this step?
Well, this goes way back, but ultimately the first major point is judicial review. The idea that the Supreme Court reviews legislation of the Knesset and can strike it down if they deem it to be not constitutional. That is, violating the piecemeal rights that Israel has enshrined in its basic laws, which is a very fragmentary part of what you might call a normal Bill of Rights. But when the Supreme Court, after those laws were passed, and those laws were only passed in 1992, the Supreme Court began to strike down legislation if it was challenged by citizens in court who claimed that it was violating human or civil rights. And the court has struck down 21 and a half laws. I say that because some people count 22, but one of them, they didn't really strike it down. In 30 years, okay, in the 30 years since the basic laws were passed in 1992. So by most standards, it's not a very high rate. However, there is also judicial review of executive action. So it's not only review of legislation. And I think the most sensitive issue is when the court has ruled against a government appointment. And that really relates to one person, and his name is Aryeh Deri. He is the leader of Shas. He is a key ally for Netanyahu. Netanyahu can't form a government without him because nobody will sit under Netanyahu's leadership because Netanyahu is under investigation and on indictment. He is standing trial currently for three different charges of corruption. And Aryeh Deri is one of his only real main political allies, but Aryeh Deri himself has a record. He has a rap sheet. He's been convicted twice of corruption. One of those was a recent conviction that was worked out in a plea bargain, but citizens challenge whether he should be allowed to serve as a minister with recent convictions, not just for any crime, but for corruption, right? Abusing his position. And so when the court has intervened in the past, and it intervened particularly when Deri himself was serving as a minister, he had corruption investigations against him back in the 1990s, and the court ruled he can't serve as a minister while he's about to be indicted for corruption. And this time the court again ruled, having been recently convicted of corruption, he can't serve as a minister. There are other examples, but those are one of the main reasons why critics say the court is too interventionist. We can't govern. They're tying our hands. But there is a much deeper political angle that is more historic. And that angle is that there is a perception that the court rules based on left-wing, secular, universalist principles that are not sufficiently supportive of the Jewish aspects of Israel, the Jewish identity, the primacy of religion. And they feel that the court is trying to impose this liberal, secular, universalist worldview on a population that doesn't want it. Because the court has ruled, for example, in favor of LGBT rights, in favor of some small measures for separation of religion and state, but very, very incremental and small, because the status quo in which religion is prominent in public life is very entrenched, but there have been challenges over the years through the courts. Citizens go to the Supreme Court and petition them. That's another criticism. Can anybody just walk into the Supreme Court and challenge government policy or legislation? The answer in Israel is yes. Now, the government says this is a warped situation. The court has too much power. Anybody can go there, even if the person is not directly affected by the policy we're talking about, and claim and challenge our actions. And the court sometimes rules against legislation and government actions. And how can we govern in this kind of situation? We need to have a free hand to rule in a way that expresses the values of the people who supported us in elections. The other main critique is that the court is somehow has issued rulings that are against Israel's desired policies with relation to the West Bank. Okay, and that is the perception that the court is against Israeli expansion, against settlements, somehow against security, upholds the rights of, let's say, Palestinians who've been detained for terror suspicion. This is the accusation. And that last one, though, I mean, we can talk about any of these aspects, but that last one, I think anybody who's deeply involved from the left or the right knows that it's a very deep misrepresentation, because while the court has definitely ruled in favor of equality, in favor of rights of minorities, whether it's Arab citizens of Israel or LGBT communities, or people who have disability benefits, you know, they've generally been fairly progressive in establishing and upholding those rights. When it comes to Israel's policies in the West Bank, the court has never ruled against a policy at all. And when the court has been asked to rule on the issue of settlements as a policy, it simply said, this cannot be adjudicated. Okay, and in other ways, their court has, in a very specific, limited number of cases, has ruled against very limited forms of settlements. It's ruled against a single settlement in 1979, which set a policy against building settlements on land owned by private Palestinians. And it has ruled against a law that Israel passed in 2017 that would have made settlements legal for Israeli law on private land, kind of the answer to that 1979 ruling. And that was one of the few cases where the court struck down the entire law, not just an article, but the entire law. And that kind of thing made the government and the right wing very annoyed. So they said, you know, how can the court strike down legislation when this is a matter of our policy? The truth is that even Israel's attorney general wouldn't support the 2017 law. and said, I will not defend this law for the government in court because it looks like, an egregious violation of the individual property of Palestinians. In any case, that law was never destined to really be implemented. But these are the kinds of claims that, from the perspective of the parties in government, they say the court is taking too much power, tying the hands of our ability to govern, and trying to impose a policy that runs counter to what our voters want. That's their argument.
So I just want to jump in and ask you, now we've heard about why the supporters of this reform are seeking to have it pushed through. What is drawing so many people out and into the streets, and can you're an expert on the demographics of what goes into public opinion. Can you break down the kind of constituent groups that are participating in these protests, and from, I guess, the sort of expected, the liberals who get out whenever there's a protest, all the way to those who are maybe, more surprising to see participating in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the reason why why this has become such a sweeping protest is because Israelis are, first of all, doing a bit of a crash course in democracy. And what I'm finding surprising is that I thought it was sort of a latent, Israelis sort of took for granted that their system was good enough for Israeli citizens, especially Jewish citizens. But it turns out that Israelis had a deeper awareness that the independence of the judiciary is the keystone, because Israeli democracy doesn't actually have any other normal checks and balances that you would see in most democratic systems, especially constitutional democracies, where you have checks and balances restraining the power of the executive. And in Israel, because we have two branches of government that are essentially not separated, the executive is drawn from a parliamentary majority. Out of that parliamentary majority, out of that coalition of parties, then we build the cabinet. And so the cabinet, by definition, actually has control over the legislature. We don't have any federal system, regional voting. We are single constituency proportional representation. So there's no direct accountability to the voters of any one area. We're not under any other international meta bodies. So we don't subject ourselves to any international groups that have their own law, like the EU. And most importantly, we don't have a formal constitution. So we don't have a formal constitution in any way. And even the basic laws that we have, as I mentioned, are very piecemeal in terms of the rights that they provide. And when I say piecemeal, it's not my subjective description. It's that these are two basic laws. One is human dignity and liberty. The other is freedom of occupation, which does not mean freedom of occupation in the West Bank. It means freedom of vocation. Those were two of four pieces of legislation that were supposed to be passed one after the other to provide a full Bill of Rights. And so what we're actually looking at, I've come to call it the Swiss cheese Bill of Rights. And even that, the constitutional status is nebulous and debated because nobody ever really defined Israel's basic laws. Now, again, most Israelis may not know the ins and outs of it, but I will tell you guys so that you can know the ins and outs of it. These basic laws can be passed by the same number of legislators as any law. You don't even need a majority to pass them. And by the same, you just need, a plurality, 2-1. And by the same logic, unless they are purposely protected in the law, they can be overturned, also theoretically, by 2-1. So there's nothing that structurally enshrines Israelis' human and civil rights, the very basic things that are the foundation of democracies. We don't even have any one law that guarantees the equality of all citizens. Now, I don't think all Israelis are lost dollars, but they know instinctively that the court has stepped in to play this role where we have a missing constitution, where we have missing primary legislation to guarantee things like equality. The court has interpreted equality because Israel calls itself a democracy, and because the term human dignity and freedom should imply equality. And all the things that aren't written in law, Israelis instinctively understand, some of them not instinctively. I mean, the judicial, Supreme Court decisions over the years have affected enormous parts of Israeli society, especially when it comes to things like gender equality, just simple, the right for women to serve as pilots, that kind of thing. Most women know that there was a turning point some time ago, and that sometime in the past, women couldn't do everything men did, but then there was a Supreme Court ruling that changed all that. Sexual harassment laws. Well, actually, that was a law. So there, the legislature did it. But now they know that once you have a law, that it requires an independent court to be able to rule in favor of citizens based on the law. So at that very broad level, and this is not to talk down to anybody, it's just that most people don't sit here doing this all day like I do. But at the very broad level, Israelis know that without a court, the laws don't mean anything without a court to adjudicate this.
So who's getting out there? I mean, like, just going back
Who's
to my
getting
question,
out there? Yeah.
like the range and what,
right.
How do you see like this coalition of protesters broadening now?
Yeah. The range, well, it's related to the first part. I mean, if I answered the first part of the question by saying Israelis instinctively understand democracy, there's something much more accessible and making people much more angry in an immediate sense. And that's that they see this as a political power grab by Netanyahu to save himself from going to jail, from his trying to get himself out of his corruption cases. And so that angers them as much as the injury to Israeli democracy. So at first, in the very beginning, you had two communities. You had those who were really angered by the attempt of what they saw as protecting himself politically at the level of governance and corruption. And then you had those who fundamentally know that even if the court isn't placing any limits on the government with relation to the occupation, that this was fundamentally going to allow the government to continue expanding and maybe annexing. So you had two communities, one that generally wanted to protect the independence of the judiciary, prevent the political takeover, were offended by the idea that Netanyahu could have unrestrained power to protect himself. And the other community that said, if the judiciary goes and if the Supreme Court goes, even though they're not always on our side, that's all we have. And so those two communities in the very first week split into two different demonstrations, because if you have 3 Jews, you need to have 4 synagogues. And that's how it started. But within the first couple of weeks, the public opposition to this seemed to just catch fire. And that's when you know that it went way beyond people who define themselves as left-wing and spread into the very mainstream and centrist communities. And lots of people started showing up saying, I'm right-wing, I've always been right-wing. I voted, people who voted for the coalition or voted for Likud or former Likud voters, but it is certainly stratified politically. Okay, so when we see in polling, first of all, is that an extraordinary number of people claim to have taken part in the demonstrations in general, which is, people, you never expect more than 5 or 6% at the best of times to actually go out and demonstrate in democratic countries. That's, I follow this at the level of polling. At present, we have 18% who say that they have participated in general in Israeli society. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but it is still extraordinary. And it may not be that much of an exaggeration, but of course, that is not evenly distributed across the different political communities. People who are secular claim that about 1/3 of them have gone out, have done something, demonstrate or sign a petition or something like that. It's a smaller portion among people who define themselves as Masorati, traditional, or national religious, Orthodox, right? But even those numbers are in the single digits percentage-wise, but still 5, 6%. Those are remarkable numbers. I'm just looking at some of the recent numbers that came out. Among traditionalists who are not religious, but people who say, I am Masorati, but I'm not Dati. We know these terms, right? Those people,
conservative Orthodox. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but conservative who are a little bit light, and conservative who are more conservadox. So conservative light, 15% say they have gone out. Conservadox, 8%. Those numbers are extraordinary. I have never seen numbers like that. Usually, the last time we had a social protest that was big was in 2011. And it was very sweeping because everybody suffers from the cost of living here. And at that point, I think the average was still under 10% who said they had gone out to demonstrate. Even among the national religious community, and these are the people who are basically most of the settlers or a big chunk of the settlers, and people who are Orthodox without any qualification. According to the most recent survey by the Israel Democracy Institute, 6% of them say they have gone out to demonstrate, which these numbers sound small, but relative to how many people ever take action, it's a lot. And specifically for that community, which is very right-wing in all other ways in terms of their voting behavior, to be taking part of this shows that there is a real wedge within, certainly it's not a wedge for the center and the left. They are completely together in criticizing this. And the vast majority of the Arab citizens of Israel are against it, even though for reasons we can talk about, they're not nearly as prominent in the demonstrations. The only community that in this survey, and this makes perfect sense, had 0% who say they are supporting it or have done anything is the ultra-Orthodox. And that's because the ultra-Orthodox view the Supreme Court as their bitterest enemy. The Supreme Court is Haman for them. And so, no, they are certainly not out protesting, although I'm sure you can find people on the fringes. But I sort of disagree with the analysis that it's all about a religious secular divide, because I think there are many religious people who still think that Israel needs to have an independent judiciary. And in any case, many Israelis, even if they generally support the criticism that I've mentioned of the courts, and I should say the whole judiciary, because the criticism goes beyond the Supreme Court. I think many people at this point are afraid that the reforms that have been proposed are simply too extreme. They really cut off any judicial independence. They are essentially a political takeover. They give unrestrained power, as I've mentioned, not only to the executive to govern, but to choose the justices, to choose the legal advisors to the ministries. And they basically practically would destroy judicial review of legislation or policy. So I think that even people who accept the critiques are nervous that it's going too far in the other direction. And even beyond that, there are some people who may even support the reform, but have been taken aback by how vicious the public debate is becoming, and the fact that nobody seems to be able to control how extreme the rhetoric is on both sides. I don't like moral equivalencies, but there are very high emotions coming from both sides. Even Israel's president a few days ago said, I have never used, I'm quoting him, he said, I have never used this term before, but after speaking with people from all sides of the country, anybody who thinks there cannot be a civil war here is mistaken. Those are his words. And so I think everybody was taken aback by that, even some strong supporters of the reforms. And we know this because one of the ringleaders, one of the research, it's really kind of a lobby group in a way, that has been at the forefront of the critiques of the judiciary for years, which is called Kohelet. Even their team has put out statements saying, well, we should negotiate and we should be careful and we should maybe eventually pass a Bill of Rights. So even some of the people who are the biggest advocates for this have been concerned about the consequences.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you about that because the two sides seem so dug in, and we are seeing, I mean, scattered signs of violence, right? I mean, everything from throwing eggs at protesters to I saw driving mopeds or a car into crowds. The police have been using water cannons now for a few weeks, and you do see a number of people on the coalition side who seem to be having some doubts, right, or some panicky thoughts. I Yuli Edelstein, Zohar, David Baton have all sort of called for a slowdown or a freeze. What did you make of Miriam Adelson saying what she said the other day along the same lines?
Well, I don't want to assume that everybody knows Miriam Adelson's role in this whole thing. I mean, her husband, may he rest in peace, Zichrono Livracha, founded Israel Hayom, which is currently the highest circulating daily newspaper in Israel. It is a free newspaper, and it was established in order to help give a platform mostly for Netanyahu's general way of thinking. It was right-wing, but more than it was right-wing, it was just supportive of Netanyahu's agenda. Since he has left us, Miriam Adelson has taken the paper in a somewhat different direction. I don't know how directly involved she is, but I would say that for the last pretty much since Netanyahu fell under serious investigation, let's say from around 2017, couldn't put an exact date on it. His investigation started around 2016. Israel Hayom was one of the strongest voices expressing absolute vitriol against every part of the judiciary, from the Supreme Court to the Attorney General to the state prosecutor, right down to the police and the police investigators. Every day you would look at the op-eds and there was another frothing, like, I'm trying to convey the tone. It wasn't just the critique, because a paper associated with the religious community, Makor Rishon, also expressed critical views of the judiciary, but in a much more thoughtful well-argued way. These were like broadside attacks every day from Israel Hayom for years. And then the moment Sheldon Adelson left the picture and Miriam Adelson took over, the paper really took, I think, a noticeably different tone. Now they publish a greater variety of articles on that issue. They are more than, they're more willing to publish voices who, are critical of the judicial reform, and even the ones who are supportive of the judicial reform. And it is still generally in favor of the reforms the government is trying to make. They're just more measured. So I'm not surprised. Clearly she came in with a different perspective. And in terms of Likud, I have to say that I think there's too much of a tendency to presume that this whole direction of policy is all because of the far, far right, all because of the religious Zionism party, all because of the ultra-Orthodox, long-standing anger at the Supreme Court for trying to, roll back some of their long-term privileges. And the religious Zionists because they want to have, greater control to greater influence over Israel's policies, both in terms of religion and state and in terms of the territories. Likud has taken a leading role, and it's not new. Okay, it even predates Netanyahu's cases. This is something that I think is not being portrayed accurately in the Israeli discourse right now. But it's not that long ago that we had the 18th Knesset, which to my mind was the infamous Knesset of 2009 to 2013. Okay, feels like a different lifetime. But that was the Knesset where we really saw a series of laws and bills intended to undermine the status of the Arab minority in Israel, intended to undercut critical civil society groups, intended to constrain certain forms of political speech. And that's when you saw civil society getting outraged, and criticizing the legislation and starting to take the legislation to court. And that's when you saw the first stage of bills designed to constrain the power of the court, specifically for judicial review. And that's when you started to see the narrative that the justices were imposing their worldview on the public. So this goes way back. Netanyahu would portray himself as holding back those extreme forces. He would portray himself as a defender of the independent judiciary. And people say now, he's changed so much. Look how he's changed. How can he be leading this reform, which is designed to undercut the independence of the judiciary, when he used to say all these very impassioned things supporting, the independent court? If you look closely, every single time people quote Netanyahu in his defense of the Supreme Court's independence, they're all from February 2012. Okay, it's 11 years ago. I mean, I haven't read every single thing he's said or written since then, but I do, follow this closely. I don't think there's much more after that. And his justice minister was the one who insisted that, again, if you read the coalition basic guidelines document, it is the number one priority. They're supposed to do this before anything else. And I think part of the criticism we're seeing, including from some Likud figures, is that the government has neglected lots of other burning stuff on the agenda. And burning, I mean literally, right? We have escalating security problems and attacks. So those, I know this is a long way of getting back to your question, but those Likud members who are taking a step back, and Yuli Edelstein is the only one who's actually done anything about it because he absented himself from the Knesset on the day of one of the important votes. But the others have and they've made it very clear. We're advocating slowing it down, but they are completely voting with the coalition. And they are completely ideologically aligned with the mission of constraining the court's authorities. But they think that they're going to get punished by the voters, and they're worried about social discord.
What it says to me is that the protests are working. But I guess what I want to know from you is, because you've lived through protests before, where does this lead? I mean, what is the, can the protests really work to stop this? Is there an end game for Bibi in this? Or is it just going to continue the way Israeli things do, where they just kind of slow down and go on for eternity, like Bibi's trial?
Yeah. Well, it's, obviously it's like a little bit of prophecy. I don't know. But for one thing, we are in uncharted territory. Yeah. I don't think anybody's ever tried to make any sort of change this dramatic, this severe, this fast in the entire constitutional order. Now, just to give you some background, I want people to understand the claims. that the government is making. The government is saying in 1995, the court asserted for itself that it has the authority to strike down legislation that we've made. That was a revolution. We didn't ask for it. They did that on their own. I disagree with the claim. The court made that ruling based on laws that the Knesset passed 3 years earlier, and then refrained from striking down any law until 1997.
Yeah.
5 years between the basic law legislation and the first strike down. That's not a rapid revolution. That's 5 years of thinking about it. Never mind. I think that, that's one of the reasons why we're in uncharted territory right now. So the protests are huge, but there is no legal, structural, or institutional reason why the government should have to stop the legislation, which is why every day we hear the government digging in and saying protests are all well and good. Proof that we have a vibrant democracy. Everybody can protest, but we're still going to do the legislation. The president, has twice given a speech about the kind of compromise he wants to reach. Last week, he actually presented some compromise plans. The government rejected it right away. And so, no, there's no reason why the government would be forced, for any particular reason to stop it. However, the distinction that I made in the beginning between expressing discontent and actually taking action that disrupts regular life and the economy, I think is different. That's an important distinction. And I think that there are two main concerns that if, beyond the protesters themselves that have, three, I would identify three kinds of disruptions that are very worrying to the government that could, eventually cause the government to back down. Is this the time to get into it?
Yeah, talk about this because I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. So one is, I'm not even, I'll start with what I think is probably the more innocuous of the three, but still influential, powerful. And that is strikes. There have been 2 days so far, if I remember correctly, that during the week, general businesses, private sector called strikes to allow people to go to demonstrations during the week. Now, every time businesses shut down for a whole day, that's an enormous loss to the economy. If somebody should call a school strike, that means parents all have to stay home. And we have a school strike now anyway in high schools because of the teachers union. But if it was a widespread thing that, every day like that is billions of shekels lost. So that's very disruptive to everything going on. Even the traffic disruptions, blocking highways is bad, but not that bad. Although blocking traffic in the airport is very disruptive too. So that's one thing. And I think that the next immediate concern is protest among reserve duty soldiers, but particularly the Air Force unit that has made a statement that they're not going to show up for reserve training. Now, today, another statement came out by another group of reservists who do volunteer reserve duty. So far, it's at the margins, right? It's people who, pilots are critical, but it's training, it's not actual operations. Okay, the distinction is that, you want to keep in touch with what you do as a pilot. We all prefer that, but nobody's saying I'm not going to go to Syria to bomb the convoys of weapons heading for Hezbollah, which is something that Israel does all the time. Israel bombs those convoys so that Hezbollah can't arm itself. There have been hundreds of these strikes. Nobody would refuse to do that so far. So it's not operational refusal. And it's also reservists or even volunteer reservists. So far, it has not sunk down to the level of regular soldiers reporting for duty.
Yeah, but I think those two reservists really matter, and they do a lot of major actions. Yeah,
they absolutely do. In fact, the group that announced its or a group within the volunteer reservists today were some sort of special operations unit of volunteer reservists. So nobody's happy about that. Everybody's worried that in itself their refusal to show up for training could have an impact, but even more so the fear that it could trickle down to regular soldiers or laterally spread to operational action.
Can I just jump in with one point about
and then there's one third way.
Just for the military members in particular, isn't there, it's not just a general support for, maintaining the judiciary as it is. There's a particular concern that they have, right? If the judiciary ceases to be independent in the eyes of the international community. Could you just explain that?
Sure. So Israel, as people probably know, is undertaking policies that put it at risk of that many claim already is violating international law, particularly not specifically the occupation, but the fact that it has turned into an effective form of annexation, that the settlements violate the Geneva Convention and therefore violate international law, and many other violations of Palestinian rights under occupation. And there are many people who are trying to sue or pursue their claims against Israel in international courts. Some of these proceedings have advanced in incremental ways. And to the extent that international courts rule on individual responsibility, the first thing the international courts do is look whether the country has its own independent judiciary who is willing to prosecute the actual claims. And some of the international courts will then say, okay, if the country is prosecuting these claims on its own, then we might see that as a reason not to step in and rule against a country if they have their own independent judiciary. And up until now, the idea that IDF soldiers would be held responsible for specific incidents or potential war crimes, there is actually here they're talking about it as a kind of defensive shield or an iron dome of protection that they enjoy from international prosecution, because the Israeli courts can try their cases. Now, in practice, it's a very complicated reality, because in practice, very few Palestinian claims against Israeli soldiers ever end in a conviction. Okay, they either go through military courts or sometimes through civilian courts, but a very, very tiny fraction ever really result in a conviction. If there is a conviction, it's usually a very short sentence, and usually those sentences are commuted. But at least it's been hard to claim that Israel's judiciary is somehow not independent. Okay. And so one of the biggest arguments is that if there is no judicial independence, soldiers will be completely exposed to international prosecution.
Right. I interrupted you, but you wanted to go to a third.
Yeah. So the first one would be domestic strikes. That would be something that seriously disrupts life here. The second would be army refusal, army, air force, or security forces. And the third is, I think, the weakening of Israel's international economic position. And this was very early on. Once the reforms were released, we saw multinational companies, Israeli venture capital and high-tech industry saying, this is going to be a disaster for us because outside investors will not want to invest in Israel if they don't believe our judiciary is independent, because, of course, it's the same as the EU. If you don't have an independent judiciary, how can claims be fairly adjudicated if there's a business conflict? The entire system of cooperation, of international economic cooperation, depends on having some sort of independent institutions for adjudication of disputes. And so right away, there was a fear that Israel would lose its credit ratings. Some of the international credit agencies have already warned that that is a likely possibility. The head of the Bank of Israel has sounded certain alarm bells. The head of research in the Bank of Israel resigned his position in order to join the protests because he was so worried. The heads of the major high-tech companies in Israel, some of Israel's most powerful companies, have spoken to the leadership, trying to convince them why this is a bad idea. The shekel has lost value, although that's a little bit populist to say because the shekel was already losing value before. But this has certainly been accelerated by everything that's going on. And I think that the scariest thing I heard is not something that's being well reported in the news, but I heard it from somebody who's fairly high level at one of the country's biggest banks, which is that once your international position, once the international economic finance community has lost faith in your market, the damage can take 20 years to undo. And so, Israel has had generally robust and resilient economic growth. So this is a real fear. And those kinds of things, I think, can affect the government, those three things.
Okay, so looking ahead, without looking too far ahead, let's just assume that this does get pushed through, because as you say, the coalition is so dead set on doing so. I guess the next thing is, does it precipitate a constitutional crisis in which, for example, they're trying to pass this law now that says the Supreme Court can't use its powers of judicial review. The Supreme Court could, of course, overturn that.
Right.
Then what? Is that when we see, civil war? Is that when we see startup nation become pack up nation? I mean, what is next?
Well, I mean, this kind of question makes me very uncomfortable because I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. But I can say that we have had several moments of very precarious, almost constitutional crises at this level over the last 2 years, roughly. And the most recent one was not very long ago. And that was when the Supreme Court ruled yet again that Aryeh Deri cannot serve as a minister because of his recent conviction. And we all know that Netanyahu needs Deri, because if he fires Deri, that Shas might leave the government, topple his coalition, go into elections again. And there was every reason to think Netanyahu was about to simply reject a court order. And nobody knew what would happen. But in the end, he diffused that crisis. He managed to get rid of Deri. But now, of course, one of the laws the government is trying to pass would allow him to come back and serve, even though he's been convicted of corruption, which in a way is like overturning the court. And then a couple of years ago, there was another mini constitutional crisis when, I don't want to get into all the details, but it was a similar clash of who has authority, the Knesset or the Supreme Court. All we have to go on is what happened in those two cases. In those two cases, the government both times managed to back down and reach some sort of a compromise. But I don't feel like that's a great harbinger of, or like a great predictor for how it's going to go, because those were the times when the government was sort of moving the bar, saying, we're going to at least challenge the Supreme Court. We're going to come very close to defying the Supreme Court. We're almost defying the Supreme Court. Next time, they'll probably go further. And so I don't know if it turns into violence. There's been a lot of fear that if there is any contradiction over what kind of policy, for example, the police should take, and this is every day now, because we haven't even talked about our Minister of National Security, who is one of the supporters of Meir Kahane from the Religious Zionism Party, but from actually his own faction, the Jewish Power Party, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And every day he's giving the police instructions that are well beyond his authority as minister to direct their actual operational decisions, trying to get them to take much harsher, more extreme, violent measures against protesters. And the question is starting to become very, very, immediate. Who will the armed forces of the police listen to? If the Supreme Court rules that they can't do something and he says they should, which are they loyal to? If they listen to the minister, we're going to start seeing violent police crackdowns like you would see in an authoritarian state. It will look much more like Putin's way of treating protesters. It's very hard to imagine that. And I don't tend to be the kind of person who gets alarmist and hyperbole, but this is a very immediate question right now, because every day he is issuing some sort of order. In the beginning, I think a lot of the veteran commentators and analysts here were laughing at him, saying, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Ministers can't do that."
Yeah. Is there any polling the views of the police force itself?
I haven't seen any polling of the police, but I can say that it's been rather remarkable to see how much vocal opposition there is coming from certainly the army and various elements of the armed forces. And the police, it's a little bit hard to know, because we had a strange situation was it last week or 2 weeks ago now? I forget. Everything's happening so fast. I think it was just last week when the Minister of National Security, who is basically the Minister of Internal Security, police, the person who controls the police, asked the police chief to fire a Tel Aviv district commander from the police, and the police chief did it. Now, they tried to get out of it, and they said, "Oh, we had already agreed that he would be out of his position. We just didn't agree on the timing, and then he asked me to do it now, and so I did it now." But the police chief took so much criticism for that, because it made it sound like he was doing the bidding of the minister, when police chief is supposed to be responsible for that level of decision. That he then came out and said, "I made a mistake. I should not have done that." And we have to be clear about where the lines of authority are in the police. So it seems like most of the professional layers of government, of the public service, are against the reform, whether or not they want to openly discuss it. I'm not going to pretend. There are also elements who are for it. There are people, there was interesting conversations within the Justice Ministry. Some people are against it, but there are some people who are at least on the side of the general orientation of the government on this. But it's hard for me I haven't seen any indication, I haven't seen any evidence that the people in the police or the army or the Air Force or the other security forces, even the Mossad had to, the chief of the Mossad had to formally allow Mossad figures to go and demonstrate, as long as they don't give interviews to the press, because there was so much demand. So I haven't seen any evidence that those communities are mounting some sort of support for this kind of, it's interesting. It's like the Shabak, by the way, the Israel's internal security agency, was traditionally the most lawless. Their existence was not even known or admitted in public, until the late 1950s. And the first time Israel ever had a law constraining their activities was in 2002. They could do anything they wanted. Never mind, we had a Supreme Court ruling in 1999 that limited some of their interrogation practices, but essentially they were lawless. They lied as a method, as one of your great reporters at the New York Times has published in his book, that's Ronen Bergman. I mean, this is one of the most lawless communities, but again, from all of the security apparatus, I have not seen any indication of organized support for removing legal constraints. Do you know what I mean? It's a little bit ironic in a way.
Yeah. I want to get a few audience questions. We have a little bit more time. But can you maybe give us some thought or two about what those of us in the United States who are watching this can do if we want to help? I mean, I think we're so used to being told to butt out, to send money, but mind our own business unless we want to make Aliyah. But what can we do? Especially if we, we have our own issues over here with democracy. But as we are watching yours unfold, what can we do?
Yeah. Well, that's the only question that, we were talking about the questions here that I always get a little scared because I don't think there's any one answer that I can really give. I mean, I think you're doing the first thing right now. Honestly, to learn the situation, and I will reveal that I have a better pedigree than you even said in my bio for this because I am completing these very moments a book about the history of Israeli democracy in which I try to convey just how weak the foundations from a political science perspective, although it's written to be accessible, but the foundations were very weak. And so, I think the mistake that Americans have made because they love Israel is to take it for granted that Israel is democratic. And Israelis have apparently made that mistake as well. But when you take democracy for granted, you can lose it. And I think that anybody who really cares about Israel, first of all, learn the reality. And so I don't want to, overstate my role, but I do think that the more you understand about what is missing in terms of Israel's democratic institutions, the more you will at least be able to understand how much and how you might engage in it. I think that in America, when Trump was elected, I know many people thought it was going to be bad for democracy. And those who were concerned, I don't want to assume anybody in the audience who you voted for or what you support, but those who were concerned, I remember a lot of the conversations said, this is a very unusual moment, but we have institutions that will protect our democratic culture. Yes. And one of those institutions is the Constitution. Israel doesn't have structural checks and balances on its government. Israel doesn't have a constitution. And moreover, Israel has historically numerous communities who view themselves as beyond the law or view the law as instrumental. And democracy we have grown accustomed to a very compromised version of democracy. So we are vulnerable to more egregious attacks without even realizing it. Although I think we've all been surprised to find out how much Israelis realize the attack is there. So first of all, learning about it much more than this conversation is if this matters to you, yes, and don't take it for granted. In terms of what can be done, I mean, supporting civil society here. If there's American money flowing, and if Israelis say, keep those checks coming, it's your decision about where those checks go. 250,000 people cannot demonstrate without some support. I mean, they can, but when I walk into my doctor's office and she's wearing a bright red T-shirt that says you can't have health without democracy, somebody had to pay for that T-shirt. And somebody has to pay for an amplification system so people can give speeches. And the amplification has not been good enough. I go to the demonstrations, I can't hear the speeches. So, if you're supporting Israel anyway, financially, if this is something that you have ever thought about where you give your money, look up the organizations who reflect the kinds of things that matter to you. That's another simple way to do it. And I think I would stop there for now because, I do think it's also been very, very meaningful for those who are opposed to the judicial reforms to see Jewish communities demonstrating around the world. I mean, I know demonstrating isn't everybody's
I think
thing,
there are
but
demonstrations happening around the country today, actually, in the United States.
Right.
And just because you're writing that book or finishing it, and good luck with that.
It'll never be finished.
If I hope the story of Israeli democracy is never finished. If Israeli democracy is so fragile that it could be imperiled so greatly, so quickly by a government with such a narrow majority, it's just a few seats. Why hasn't it faced a crisis like this before? There have been, you alluded to some other crises, but this one is the most existential I can think of, isn't it?
Well, this is the most existential because this is the most extensive effort to change the system entirely, to change the foundations of the system. But I would say the crisis, I would say it's not just that Israeli democracy, what was the word you used? Precarious, vulnerable. I use that word too, but I would say the problem is that it's compromised. It has been compromised for a long time. So it's different from seeing it as vulnerable, like a fragile structure of matchsticks. What I'm saying is that it is partial. Yeah. And the more is because Israelis have allowed that, I'm not blaming any one person. People are busy day to day. It's not everybody's job. But I think that, the way we've structured society, we have always had a situation where some part of the people we govern are by law unequal. And that is, in the long term, if you want to know what you can do, we need to think about how Israel can be a better place in the long term for its democracy in the deeper ways, because then Israelis have a higher standard for what democracy actually means. That would be, another way of looking at it. No, we haven't had this kind of, visible crisis, but you could say in the long kind of under the surface way, there has been a very, partial kind of compromised version of democracy all along.
Yeah. Now, as I understand it, in the formation of the state, they kind of kicked the can down the road on the Constitution because it was too difficult to take on all the different parties and the ultra orthodox and that balance and everything. The can's kind of here, and you wonder if maybe it would have been easier to confront these challenges back then. Why don't we open it up to some questions? There's a microphone, I understand, in the back there, so that you can be heard, or you can just shout it out and I'll repeat it if need be. Yeah, either way. Go ahead, Sal.
Isn't there a constitution in the Knesset that's been trying to form? Because we even had a program some years ago where they gave us materials to discuss what would be the ins and outs of forming the Constitution. That was one question. The other is, isn't it deep down? Don't you think in the end it's going to be a matter of compromise? Because the think tank who gave rise to this even said that they threw in things in there that they didn't expect would stay for negotiation. Plus, they said that they weren't even. He said that weren't even interested in the policy that strikes down laws because they didn't need that if they got the changes about the judiciary. And then finally, isn't it in the end just a matter of their attack, the right and Mizrahi attack on the last bastion of what they call the elite liberal, which is a judiciary that prevents them from getting where they want to go?
Good questions. Sal can run the next one of these. Go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of constitution, this country has been trying to pass a constitution in every decade through the Knesset and civil society efforts of some, scholars, academics, and legal thinkers, et cetera. Certainly since the late 1980s, all of those efforts have been ongoing. And just to go back to why they kicked the can down the road, and you said, would it have been easier then? It was not easy politically then, and the state was brand new and fighting wars and dealing with immigration. I don't want to underestimate how tough that was, but the drafts that were being discussed between late 1947 and 1949 were extremely enlightened. I mean, enlightened in the sense that they had everything you would imagine in a constitutional democracy and establishing all the basic civil and human rights that we see in the American Constitution and most other progressive constitutions. I don't mean progressive in the American current political sense. I mean just for the time. And the people who drafted those constitutions were religious Zionists. They were religious, but the constitutions failed because of a couple of major reasons. We often think that Ben-Gurion was too worried about the opposition of the ultra-Orthodox party that he wanted to keep in his coalition. That's true, because they didn't want a constitution that would provide equality for everybody. They wanted to be autonomous. They wanted to have different privileges, et cetera, et cetera. They wanted the only law to be coming from the Torah. So for them, that would be so terrible. They would leave the coalition. Ben-Gurion didn't want it. The other main reason is that Ben-Gurion did not really want to have checks and balances on his power. And that's why I say there is some original sin here of Israel not really having democratic mentality in terms of governance. And the third is that nobody really wanted to provide a civic basis, a legal basis for equality for the Arab citizens who were being held under martial rule at the time. So all of those things have remained prominent. It's just that it's not Ben-Gurion in power anymore. But the difference is that the kinds of constitutions we are considering now, or even Bill of Rights, are far more restrained. We can't get anything like the kind of drafts that were written and elaborate in 1947, 8, 9. And in fact, even the draft written in 1973, published as a platform of Likud under Menachem Begin, is a draft that I would be thrilled to adopt today. We're never going to get back there. Okay, now in terms of will they negotiate?
It was Begin who said there are judges in Jerusalem, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, he said so many things, right? A deep believer and never mind him, Jabotinsky, I mean, was one of the most eloquent proponents of constitutional liberal democracy. So in terms of the question of will the government negotiate, even Forum Kohelet, which is the name of that think tank, which was, by the way, nobody elected them, but they have been incredibly influential in developing the ideas and the legislation and the specific policies. I don't really know. I mean, the government claims it's willing to, negotiate, but you can say that. But right now, both sides are very dug in. So they may say theoretically they're willing to negotiate, but each side is willing to negotiate, half a degree from its starting point, and therefore they're rejecting the other side's positions out of turn. Now, again, I don't want to create a false binary here, but on that measure, both sides are being very, very stringent. So I think that at this point, the government is negotiating with itself, in the sense that if they feel there's too much public pressure, they will tone it down. Of course they will. Every law gets toned down in the committees. Every law comes out less draconian if it's a sensitive law, or less, far-reaching. It might not be a bad thing. Then it started, right, in its preliminary stages. It always becomes a little bit more moderate. So that probably would happen anyway. But the government is so far doing that kind of calculation within its own parties. And because right now there's a complete, total disconnect between the opposition parties and the government. And moreover, the opposition parties are really very weak right now in the sense of their leadership holds very little authority. They've been sort of out there, but they're not leading the protests. There's not a great sense. This is one of the accusations of the right wing that is kind of funny. They keep saying, oh, these protests aren't real. They're just a front for all these people who want to elect, these opposition parties. It's really, that is totally disconnected from the reality. The politicians are nowhere in the protest. People aren't holding up signs for them. The only signs people are holding up are of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. Those are the only personal signs I see. Everything else is slogans about democracy. So it's interesting. Anyway, that's the answer to that question. In terms of I guess the last question was really, is this all about the Mizrahi-Ashkenazi divide? Was that the real question? Or were you really asking about whether it's people who have a more traditionalist and conservative worldview against a liberal worldview?
Against what they consider the elite liberal dominance of the judiciary that won't change because it's embedded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the main accusation if I was getting more deeply into the narrative, right? The narrative explanation for why supporters of the reform are so, emotionally angry at the judiciary is because they say that the justices appoint themselves, that they're self-reinforcing. They appoint people who are just like them demographically, just like them in terms of their judicial perspective, their jurisprudence, their legal activism, right? Their willingness to intervene in legislation and policy, and that they all support, and that they're elites and they're out of touch and they weren't elected and they don't represent popular will.
It sounds
like what?
They sound like Kohanim or something. They're just going to self-perpetuate. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, so that is an idea that's reinforced a lot in the public discourse, and it's not new. This has been kind of rehashed for, I would say, very forcefully over the last roughly 10 years. That's when I first started noticing it in a very significant way. It's only partly true, in fact. Okay. In fact, Israel's Judicial Appointment Committee has 9 people on it. 3 of them are justices, 4 of them are politicians. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that the coalition can control it, because out of those 4 politicians, traditionally, one of them is supposed to be from the opposition. And that leaves 3 who are figures related to the coalition against 3 justices. Since you need a majority of 7 to agree on any one judicial appointment, if the justices vote together, they can veto. So it's true that they have a veto, but that's very different from saying they are self-appointed. And that's one part of it. And in terms of elites, yes, anybody who reaches the highest level of his or her profession, by definition, becomes an elite, by definition. But that doesn't mean a person started with privilege. Okay, the court is much more diverse than that narrative conveys. There are religious Jews on the court. There are settlers on the court. One of the people on the court is not, I don't think she's a settler today, but she was like the equivalent of the Hilltop Youth in her youth. Okay, not the Hilltop Youth who necessarily attacked Palestinians, but she was out there founding settlements. Two of them are currently living in settlements. There's generally an Arab justice on the court. I mean, sometimes you hear people say, but there's no ultra-Orthodox on the court. Well, that's true, because there are very few ultra-Orthodox who would make a profession studying secular law. Why would they do that? It's not their ethos. And so, yes, there is that perception, but I think that perception is partly A, inaccurate, and B, consistently reinforced in what I would consider a manipulative way.
Wow.
Anybody else? Yes, right here.
Yes, hi. My question is something mentioned very much in passing earlier, that the Palestinians are not so much involved. Would that be the case?
Yeah, well, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, they are by and large against the reform, as far as we know from polling. They are not as prominent in the demonstrations. And the demonstrations have been very, very consciously adopting the most patriotic national Jewish Israeli symbols. The Israeli flag, this is extraordinary, I think, has been completely co-opted as a symbol of the opposition to the reforms. If you see anybody now carrying an Israeli flag, 100% that person is protesting the reforms. I looked across my street at my neighbor's house the other day. That person was carrying has put an Israeli flag on the balcony, clearly a sign of support. I mean, of opposition for the reform. And so these are and the other thing is that the debate has centered quite prominently around the military. Those pilots who are refusing to do training, and reservists who might do training, and the possibility of mutiny in the army. And so it's like each spokesperson for that kind of protest is outbidding one another to prove that their credentials are more militaristic. I was in combat unit. I fought in the Yom Kippur War. I spoke to a demonstrator who had a sign saying I fought in the Independence War. And so it's like, Israeli Jews know that the highest currency in Israeli society is your army service. And this is also striking because we keep thinking it's changed over time. It really is showing that in some ways that hasn't changed. People believe that they will have the most possible credibility the more they prove their military credentials, and the more they prove their Jewish Israeli symbolic commitment. And that is, not incredibly welcoming for Palestinians. Having said that, there is always a community of people who go out to demonstrate in the name of connecting it to Israel's policies in the West Bank occupation. There are people who have been angered by the government suggesting they might try to outlaw flying the Palestinian flag. So you see more people coming with a Palestinian flag. And, there are some Palestinians every week who come out, but they're just a small community. There have been Druze communities who've organized their own demonstrations, and there have been some spokespeople speaking, but it is, definitely a very Israeli Jewish nationalist environment, I would say. And of course, Palestinians under occupation, if you were referring to them, I think their attitude has been, what does the independent court matter to us anyway? It hasn't helped us.
Thank you.
Vern.
Yes, you want to stand?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I guess my question, I want to build on something David said earlier. Does the government really care what diaspora Jews think? And I just want to build on this because, David, what you said, I personally in the last month stopped giving any charity money that is going to Israel. I have canceled out of 2 trips to Israel, including a federation trip, because I am not in support of what's going on. I actually stopped giving money to the federation because I know there's a portion of my money that goes to Israel and supports the government, that overall, but do they care? Does the government care that as an individual, I stopped doing this, enough of us doing this doesn't make a difference?
Well, that's a very key question. I mean, I don't want to advocate for any position here, but I would say as an individual, probably not. But of course, strength in numbers. I mean, if there was a huge wave of people who would stop giving money to federations, then you would have the federations suffering, their budgets would be suffering as a result, and they would probably communicate that to the Israeli government. I think the Israeli government would be sensitive to that. If we were to see a significant drop in tourism from American Jews, enough that it registered, then that would become a major concern because it would hit the tourism industry. And I think that, any one of, element like that is probably not enough, but the fact is there is a cumulative effect. And so even if this government is, as we say, a very stiff-necked government in terms of their commitment to this and their resilience to the critique, I think that this is apparently, it's turning into a long-term struggle. And I think that the cumulative effect of those things, the sense of being hit from all sides by very unexpected forms, not only of expressing discontent, but in ways that actually have an impact on the economy and on certain industries and on the kind of resilience of the Jewish community and the institutional connections between diaspora Jewry and the Israeli society and government. I do think that adds up. But that, of course, would mean lots of people doing it, and I wouldn't advocate for position one way or the other because it's not my role.
We have a question in the back. He's going to go to the microphone.
Yeah, hi. I guess my question, like as a pollster, you talked about the percentages of people from the different groups protesting, but I gotta put this, and, I grew up as a political scientist where I was told, that Israeli democracy was partial because of security concerns. There always had to be some acceptance of compromise. And my perspective from the outside reading about it now is that it's being compromised now for religious values, that there's this conflict between the ultra-religious in Israel and, the more secular Jews. And so now sort of as diaspora people support Israel, you're being asked to make a different compromise. Are you willing to compromise Israeli democracy for the sake of religious values? But then when you talked about the groups who are protesting, and I've talked to David a little bit about this, there sort of seems to be this effort to communicate, no, it's not all religious because some religious people are protesting. So I'm just trying to get a sense from you, is the compromise of Israeli democracy now being driven by something different than the traditional security concerns? Is it really a religious value that's driving this? Or is it really just purely personal politics and trying in terms of affecting certainly policy initiatives or certain and I know the answer is complicated, but I'm just, trying to get a sense from you as a pollster, like, getting beyond the percentages of people who are protesting, what is actually animating sort of the political will behind each side in terms of the older divides in Israel politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting analysis of the compromises that your perspective has been, that the compromise has been Israel's not perfect democracy because of the security issue. I would have said it differently. I would have said, I mean, certainly the security issue has generated some compromises in democratic practice, but I would say that the real core of that is that the security needs, certainly since the end of the major state-to-state wars, which we haven't had a real state-to-state war in a very long time, right? Has been the response to Israel's policies and just the basic level. For the first 20 years, Israel was holding a part of its population under martial rule. For the next 55 years, it's been holding a part of its non-citizens under a military government. So I would say that is the first and biggest compromise on democratic values. And the security needs are all mostly devoted to that, to the occupation now. That's our major security operational project. And so, yes, of course, there's the regional and Middle East situation, but even a lot of our Middle Eastern enemies are no longer enemies, right? Egypt, Jordan, not enemies anymore. Iraq, no longer a threat. Gulf states on our side. The main threat is Hezbollah. Anyway, not to get too sidetracked into Middle East politics, but I would say that democracy had been compromised in fundamental ways in addition, or, maybe even alongside the security compromises you've talked about. And the religious compromise element of democracy has been with us since the very beginning, right? Since the beginning of statehood. So I would say that A, I'm not sure how new all of those challenges are. And B, when you ask what's really animating the attempt to change the system and to compromise Israeli democracy further, I would pin it down to 4 aspects that all have kind of equal weight. They just represent different communities who are supporting the reforms. One is those who want to be able to complete the annexation of the West Bank unfettered. They don't want to run into court challenges over an Israeli takeover of pretty much everything left. The next are similar overlapping communities in political life in Israel who want Israel to be more theocratic. And they're not hiding it, right? This is not like something that I'm saying critically. It's just basically what they want. They want Israel to be more Jewish, and by more Jewish, they mean more religious, and by more religious, they mean specifically very strict to ultra-Orthodox. And right now it's in incremental ways, but that's always how it's been. The third aspect I would say is those who want Israel to have a privileged status for Jews, or you might call it lower status for anybody who's not Jewish. And so that is in some ways already enshrined in the nation state law that was passed in 2018, which essentially gives Jews the exclusive right to self-determination in Israel and demotes the Arabic language and calls for investing in Jewish settlement, but no other kind of settlement. So there are other aspects in Israeli law, but the parties like the Religious Zionism Party that won 14 seats, those are people who openly want to have privileged status for Jews. It is central to their agenda. That's one of the main reasons people voted for them if they didn't vote for them for the judicial reform. But in order to do that, you need to barricade yourself or shield yourself from judicial review. And the fourth reason is to protect Netanyahu and anybody else who's corrupt and still thinks, wants to be able to serve in government. So it does protect corrupt leadership because that's who Netanyahu is right now. I mean, I don't know if he's corrupt, but he's certainly facing charges of corruption. And Aryeh Deri, we do know because he has been convicted. So those are the four animating factors. And I think that they all work, they've kind of converged. It would be hard to say which one is the most dominant.
Can I just jump in with one question that's I've never answered for myself? Do the voters of Shas love Aryeh Deri as much as the Bibistim love Bibi?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they do.
I mean,
it depends on when you ask.
Yeah.
Well, sorry?
Could the party really not exist without him?
No, it did exist without him. There was a time after he was first convicted in 1999 that the party was led by a much less charismatic guy called Eli Yishai. And in fact, by the end of Eli Yishai's term, there was a challenger who kind of broke away from Shas with a slightly more accommodationist, even some, a little more progressive perspective, considering the starting point. He didn't do very well, that breakaway, but still, Shas might, is definitely, I would say it definitely is, gets a lot of its power from Aryeh Deri's cult of personality. Yeah. And, of course, the generations have changed. Some of us are older than we care to recall, but I remember, nobody can forget who lived through this. And in some ways, even people who didn't live through it remember that when Aryeh Deri was first convicted in 1999, David, maybe you even came across this, they held huge rallies in his support and people prayed for him and sang for him. And they wrote a song about him. And the entire chorus of the song was, he's innocent, he's innocent. And then they cut an ad based on the crowd singing the He's Innocent song and used that as their campaign ad. It was all about Aryeh Deri. So yes, it maybe was a different generation, but not that long ago. And I would say he still holds, even if he doesn't have quite that mythical status yet anymore. I'm losing battery. If I get cut off, I will get back on my phone. But I think even if he doesn't have quite that mythical status anymore, he still retains his symbolic image as the martyr. Yeah. And this is a community that has felt marginalized historically and feels like somehow the state is always trying to rob it of its power. So even if people are getting a little tired of Deri, he still stands for what they consider a deep state elite, historic elite persecution and attempt to diminish them. So if he goes down, they feel that way.
All right. Before your battery runs out, I think we can wrap it up.
I have my phone. I can keep going.
Okay, but I do want to just kind of close on one, semi-rhetorical question here. You may have read that over Shabbat, Donald Trump put something out. He's likely to be indicted in the next few days. He called for protests, and the police in New York are preparing potentially for unrest. So my question to you is Israeli politics taking after American politics, or is American politics taking after Israeli politics? This has been eating at me for years.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, Donald Trump is no longer president. So he, whatever authority he has right now, it's just a matter of, his, did I freeze up?
You froze. Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Back slowly.
Well, what if I, okay.
We can hear you. Again, keep talking.
Yeah, I could turn off my video because I don't want the video to freeze. How's that?
We got you. Keep going.
Okay. So I think that we shouldn't see, let's not be too center-centric here. This isn't only about America or Israel. There is a democratic erosion in other parts of the world, in Western Europe. And I think the what distinguishes the last 10 years of populism and kind of democratic erosion in other countries is that it's not just happening among former communist countries that weren't sufficiently democratic to begin with. It's happening among Western liberal democracies where we've seen the rise of populist leaders who would prefer more consolidated power, less liberal, less progressive approaches, and to roll back progressive changes, they are willing to constrain the liberal institutions needed to protect citizens. And they use an ultra-nationalist narrative to rally supporters based on a kind of, emotional backlash against diversity, against immigration, against their national identity. Israel has its own particular form and its own particular vulnerabilities, but I don't think even America invented it. The only country we talk about now is Hungary. And that's what everybody is really concerned with, that we're going to look an awful lot like Viktor Orban's Hungary very soon.
Wow.
All right, listen, Dahlia, thank you for taking all the time. Really, that was fantastic. We're greatly appreciative, and we hope to hear from you again in the future, perhaps. But good luck,
Okay.
and
Can I just interject?
yes,
I also
go
want
ahead.
to thank David for
Sure.
organizing it. And
I tried to turn my video back on to say goodbye, but I can see it's completely stuck.
Okay, but you'll have a very hospitable audience if you ever decide to swing through Montclair, New Jersey anytime soon. I look forward to talking to you again, and keep it going out there. All right.
Thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
great questions.
All right.
Bye-bye.